React Native and how does it work?
So, what exactly is React Native? Well, as the name implies, it is related to React.js. And with React.js and React Native, you can build real React Native based mobile apps for iOS and Android, which are real apps you can distribute through the app stores and apps that can be used by any user with an iOS or Android device. Now, React.js is a library that's independent from React Native, though. React.js is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces, and it is typically used for web development. That's also the environment for which it was first created. But actually, if you worked with React.js, you might know that it's actually another library, the React DOM library, that adds the actual web support. Because React itself, the library React itself without React DOM, is platform agnostic, which means you can use React in conjunction with React DOM to build web apps, but React, the library itself, actually does not care about the underlying platform. React just gives you tools for managing state, for building virtual component trees, and then you need an extra library like React DOM for translating the result React produced to an actual platform like the browser. Now, React Native is basically an alternative to React DOM, therefore. React Native gives you a collection of special React components which you can use in your JSX code. So React Native ships with built-in components you can use. And those components are then compiled to native UI elements for the iOS and Android platforms. And React Native will also take care about this compilation step. In addition, React Native also exposes certain native platform APIs, like using the device camera, so that you can use such features in your JavaScript code, even though you need to tap into native device APIs for that. And therefore, in the end, React Native is like React DOM, it just does not target the web, the browser, as a platform, but instead iOS and Android. And React Native gives you all the components and the APIs you need to interact with those platforms and to build apps for those platforms. That is what React Native is all about. And therefore, in order to work with React Native, you also must know React.js, because you will write your code in React.js and then just use these extra React Native components and APIs in your React JavaScript code to produce those native mobile apps for iOS and Android. Now, how does React Native work under the hood, though? If you're building a React and React Native app, then you're typically writing code like this, which should look very familiar if you worked with React.js before, maybe or most likely for building browser-based apps. This is a React component, what you see here. And it's just one way of writing such a component. We could also use the function keyword instead of defining an arrow function, and we could also use a class-based component. But it's code like this which you will write for React Native, and it's code like this that will be compiled to real native app code, so which will be bundled into a real native app in the end. Now, if you take a closer look at the code snippet on the left here, you will see two components, two JSX elements in there, which you don't know from web development: the view and the text element. These are some of these special components that are exposed by React Native, which will be compiled by React Native. It is worth noting, though, that it's really just the views, just this JSX code that is compiled, not the JavaScript logic itself. I will come back to that in a second. So the components, the JSX elements you use, are compiled to native elements for the respective platforms. And to make this a bit easier to understand, take a look at this comparison table here. Here we got a bunch of elements as we would use them in the browser if we would be using React DOM, and then the equivalents for the native platforms, and then the components exposed by React Native to target those equivalents. So for example, if you want to display an input element where users can enter some text, then when building a web app, we would use the HTML input element, which is available in JSX when we're using React DOM. If we would be building a native Android app with Java or Kotlin, then it would be the built-in added text widget that is provided by Android, which we need to build. For iOS, it would be the UI text field element. And with React Native, we would use the built-in text input component, which is provided by React Native and which will then be compiled to edit text for Android or to UI text field for iOS. So React Native maps and compiles reusable components like text input or view or many other components about which you will learn throughout the course to their respective platform equivalents. That's one of the main jobs React Native will take care of. But what about the logic? I mentioned that those views, the JSX elements, are compiled to their native equivalents. But what about the JavaScript code you write outside of JSX? What about all these functions, if statements, state management? What about that? Well, unlike the UI elements, the logic is not compiled. The UI elements, which are those components exposed by React Native, are compiled as you learned. But the logic which you write in JavaScript is actually not compiled, but instead it's running on a JavaScript thread that's hosted by React Native in the native app that was built. So React Native basically spins up a simple JavaScript process as part of your native app that's being built, and it manages this process for you, and it allows this process to talk to the underlying native platform. And therefore, your JavaScript code will run as JavaScript in the native app that's being built, but it will then talk to the underlying Android or iOS platform through a basic translation bridge, you could say, that is provided by React Native as part of your native app. That's how you can think about this. And that is it for now. That's how React Native works under the hood and what it does for you. You don't need to know more. You can, of course, dive into the official docs if you do want to learn more, but that is what you should know in order to work with React Native, because I believe it's always important to have a basic understanding of how a tool works, and this is how React Native works. So I would say it's enough for the theory for now. Let's get started. And for that, you can simply search for React Native to find reactnative.dev, which is the official React Native website. Now on this site, you can learn more about React Native, and it is a great additional resource if you do want to dive deeper and learn more about it. But of course, you will learn all the essentials and everything you need to know to build React Native apps in this course. Now in here, on this site, it is a good idea to click on Get Started though, because there you'll learn how you can create a React Native project. And what you will learn here is that if you do click on Environment Setup here, on setting up the development environment, that you got two choices. That you can use a tool called Expo CLI, which seems to be recommended because it's the by default selected choice, and that you can use the React Native CLI. Now, as I just said, Expo CLI is selected by default, and indeed it is my recommendation as well, and it is the tool we will use in this course. But you could also use this alternative approach. Both approaches will give you a development environment in which you can build React Native apps. So what's the difference then? We have the Expo CLI and the React Native CLI. CLI stands for Command Line Interface, and both tools are tools that exist in order to help you create React Native projects and run React Native apps on testing devices and simulators, as well as build React Native apps so that you can ship them to the app stores. So these are the tools you need to really build apps and to get those packages, those distributable packages, which you can upload to the app stores. These two tools are crucial.